their animus towards Joe Biden, I think, is pretty directly related to the foreign policy stances that he's taken since October 7th, since the Hamas attack on Israel. There's the sense that Israel simply wouldn't be able to inflict as many casualties as recklessly as it has if it wasn't for the Biden administration effectively having their back. And that's really what is kind of at the heart of Arab and Muslim disapproval of Biden. But there has been a precipitous drop in support for Joe Biden. The Arab American Institute has released a survey in which it shows that support for Joe Biden and intention to vote for Joe Biden has dropped from around 59% in around the 2020 election, has created to about 17% in the Arab American Institute poll. Whereas among Muslims, the drop has been even starker. So Mgauge Action has put out a poll as well, showing that whereas around 70 to 80% of Muslim voters supported Joe Biden around the 2020 election, that number is in the single digits now. And so there's a very kind of clear sense that if the election were held today, there will be very little support for Joe Biden within both of these communities. The Arab and Muslim population on a national level makes up a fairly small percentage of the American electorate. But as we all know, as we're all reminded at least, every 4 years when there's a presidential election, presidents are not chosen through a national popular vote. They're chosen through the electoral college system, and in the electoral college system, each state matters, and specifically a handful of swing states matter disproportionately in deciding who ultimately becomes the president. And it just so happens that even though their percentages on a national scale are fairly small, Muslims and Arabs have an oversized influence on the outcome within states when it comes to the presidential election, particularly those swing states. Michigan, in particular, where the largest percentage of Arab Americans are, and where a very large percentage of Muslim Americans are as well. And states like Arizona, states like Georgia, and a number of other kind of swing states. And so in those states, the margins are so slim that Arab American and Muslim turnout, contribute to the ultimate outcome in favor of Biden. And to an extent that perhaps not many kind of realize. And so in the analysis that I did, if you were to take away just the Arab and Muslim turnout, not necessarily even take away, if you would just significantly decrease it, so decrease it by say maybe 50%, which again, based on recent polls, that's not too far out of reach to imagine that turnout would decrease by that much. So if you were to decrease just Arab and Muslim turnout by 50%, that effectively erases the margin of victory for Joe Biden in Arizona as well as Georgia, cuts the margin of victory significantly for him in Michigan. Now, in Michigan in 2020, he won by a much larger margin than Trump did in 2016. But if you imagine that the margin of victory is going to be fairly small, I mean, the margin of victory in 2016, if you were to cut out or significantly decrease the Arab and Muslim turnout in that state, that those number of votes in Biden's favor would be about 5 to 6 times the margin of victory in 2016. And so they have an outsized influence, kind of relative to the national population size. They have an outsized influence in these very key swing states. So if Michigan, Georgia, and Arizona flip, it's not perhaps saying it's the ball game might be a bit too overenthusiastic, but it really makes it a lot harder, right? The narrow pathway to victory for Biden gets all that much narrower, and perhaps it's basically kind of a needlehead at this point. And so if you factor in though that trend, if we see it in Michigan, if we see it in Arizona, if we see it in Georgia, we're likely to see it elsewhere. That means that Pennsylvania gets all that much more difficult to win. Wisconsin becomes a lot more difficult to win. On the outside chance, perhaps even Virginia comes into play now as well. Again, with a very large kind of Muslim and Arab population, and the sentiments that are embodied in the Arab and Muslim population are not exclusive to the Arab and Muslim population. So really, what we need to kind of consider is how Biden's foreign policy is not only going to affect turnout and vote choice when it comes to Arabs and Muslims, but for their allies as well. And when you look at polls, when it comes to the youth vote, when it comes to those considered, to place social justice in a very high priority, you can really start to see Biden's potential for reelection kind of dwindling fairly quickly. Joe Biden absolutely cannot afford to ignore the Arab and Muslim vote. I know that, again, there's this sense perhaps in Democratic circles that they are kind of fairly small in the national scheme of things. But to think that A, they don't matter, I think that's very clearly shown in my data that that's not the case. But to think that B, oh, they'll come around, come election time, yeah, I don't see any reason to think that. I mean, kind of the visceral image that we're getting out of Gaza, they don't tend to really be the kinds of things that you forget very easily. So I think Gaza will still be top of mind come November. So I don't necessarily see that there's going to be percentage-wise much of an increase for Donald Trump, presuming that he will be the nominee come November. But I think it is a fairly safe bet, quite honestly, that we'll see in November, third party voting on a scale that we haven't seen at least since the early 90s, since Ross Perot.